Recently, I took my family of 5 and my in-laws on a 17-hour train ride from Salt Lake City to Emeryville, California, near Oakland, and then back again. Today I'd like to share my thoughts on Amtrak's California Zephyr from the perspective of a passenger from Salt Lake City.
The reason for this trip was to take a fun summer vacation to the beach. My wife is originally from Northern California, and the ocean in that part of the state has a special significance to her. But unfortunately, since moving to Utah 12 years ago, we haven't had the chance to go back due to school, work, and the demands of traveling with 3 little kids. This year, with some available time and the kids a little older, we decided to go for it.
But why take the train? In the United States, almost all travel is done by car, with air travel coming a very distant second and passenger rail almost non-existent. Well, in our case, we got lucky, and 3 important factors aligned in the train's favor.
First is the distance. The total drive time from Salt Lake City to Bodega Bay is 12 hours in a conventional gasoline-fired car. But since our only vehicle is a Tesla Model 3, we would need to add in an additional 2 hours at least to include the 8 charging stops along the way. The Tesla is a fantastic car for city driving, day trips, and even road trips to neighboring states. But going 14 hours with 3 small children sitting shoulder to shoulder in the back row would not be ideal. With the costs saved by owning an electric car versus the 20th century relics known as gasoline cars, we had the means to upgrade our travel mode. Second is the state of air travel. I will grant that travel times are fast, with direct flights lasting about 2 hours, not including taxiing and time at the gates, but that is really its only redeeming feature. The conditions are even more cramped than in our little Tesla, and the number of bags you can bring is either limited or costs extra. And the ticket prices for a midday departure in the height of summer for the 7 of us would have totaled to nearly $4,000 round trip.
I should add that by this point, our in-laws had decided to join us, raising the number of passengers to 4 adults and 3 kids.
Additionally, there is the issue of pollution, which was not a factor in our decision-making, but it is an issue we should all take more seriously. Air travel may burn less fuel per passenger than a traditional gasoline-fired car, but where cars release their gases at ground level, where it can be more easily recycled into the ecosystem, airplanes release their pollution high up in the atmosphere, where it has an outsized impact on the environment. There are a bunch of online calculators you can play around with if you're curious. For example, my little sister owns an apartment, has a small economical car, and because she lives in Hawaii, and there is only so far she can go, her daily mileage is pretty low. However, because she's a musician and has to leave the island several times a year by airplane, her carbon footprint makes all the coal rollers in West Valley look like Prius-driving hippies.
So while none of this was the deciding factor, it made us very happy not to rely on air travel for this trip.
The third and last factor is that there is a train service available where we wanted to go, which is not the case for most people in the USA. We live less than 2 miles from the Salt Lake City Amtrak station, and the Bay Area is close enough to the desired beaches, or at least as close as the airports would have been. On the train, we could all bring multiple bags without extra charges, and the price for 2 family bedrooms, which sleep 2 adults and 2 children each, was roughly the same price as airfare, depending on which flight you chose. For that price, we didn't just get some soulless, rushed hustle from point A to point B. Instead, we got a 17-hour panorama of the American West, crossing the vast deserts of Nevada and the amazing Sierra Nevada mountains in California, following the original transcontinental railroad. Meals in the dining car were included in the cost of our rooms, and there really isn't a sensation comparable to eating a quality meal while gliding through rugged terrain. It's just something you have to experience for yourself. My wife is a total foodie, and she was deeply impressed with the quality of Amtrak's dinner options, cooked fresh in the onboard kitchen. Besides the dining car, there is also the observation lounge and cafe you can spend time in. Unlike the airplane or the car, on the train you are not only allowed, but encouraged to stand up and walk around, and little kids don't need to be tied down for hours on end. Crucially, according to Amtrak's schedule, the train is supposed to leave Salt Lake City at midnight and arrive in the Bay Area at 4:10 p.m., which means a significant portion of the trip would be made while we were all asleep. And because we had our own rooms, we could even keep our beds configured throughout the day if we wanted to take naps. By leaving the night before, the speed advantage of the airplane became a non-issue. In either case, we would be arriving in the mid to late afternoon, except that rather than arriving frazzled and stiff from the close quarters of the airplane, we would instead arrive refreshed and rested from the more laid-back travel of the train. Or that was the idea, anyway. I should mention here that, due to railcar shortages, Amtrak changed our reservation from 2 family bedrooms to 4 roomettes, each containing 2 beds at no additional cost to us. While some people complained that these roomettes are small, I found them to be pretty cozy. They reminded me of the cardboard box forts I used to build as a kid, with low headroom between the bunks and curtains to block out the glare, but still a pretty relaxing place to spend an afternoon. Bathrooms were located either down the hall or downstairs, including showers. To be perfectly clear, this is not luxury travel. The cars themselves are from the 1980s, back when rail cars were designed to look and feel more like airplanes, and have had minimal upgrades since then. The vibe reminded me strongly of the Puget Sound ferries in Seattle, a sort of begrudging, government-approved, minimum viable product sort of thing. Most new sleeping trains around the world no longer use multiple levels, tiny sleeping compartments like roomettes, or even lounge observation cars. Amtrak is already in the process of procuring replacement cars, and it is widely believed that the replacements will be similar to the European night jets, with everything located on a single level. I will be sad to see the superliners go, because, in my opinion, with a thorough and modern update, the superliners could continue to provide a comfortable and satisfactory travel experience for many years to come. But more on that later. Amtrak service is, on the whole, best described as inconsistent, or perhaps manic-depressive. When things go well, train travel can be a bright reflection of the glory days of passenger trains in America. However, when things go badly, they can become disastrous. The most infamous problem is trains running late, and this is especially true on the California Zephyr, which is routinely ranked as one of Amtrak's most delayed routes, in no small part because it is also Amtrak's longest route, spanning a total of 2,438 miles. Amtrak's own data acknowledge that the train is on time only a third of the time in summer, and a quarter of the time during the winter. Even worse, Amtrak gives its long-distance trains a half-hour grace period, meaning a train arriving 29 minutes behind the posted schedule is still considered to be on time. The lesson here is that you really shouldn't be taking the train if you've got a tight connection to make. Using this very helpful website, link in the description below, I was able to determine that the average arrival time in Emeryville is just under 2 hours later than the published schedule. The median arrival time is somewhat better, but I chose to act conservatively, and I arranged for our rental cars to arrive at the station at 7 p.m., or 3 hours after our scheduled arrival, in order to avoid potential late fees and the risk of cancellation.
So, that was the plan. Here's how it actually went.
From my very first interaction at Salt Lake Central Station, I thought I had bungled the entire trip. Though we had arrived 45 minutes before the train arrived, which was running an amazingly prompt 10 minutes late, we had unfortunately not arrived 45 minutes ahead of the published schedule, which is a requirement in order to check your bags into the baggage car. This turned out to be a complete non-issue, as there is a generous shelf located at the bottom level of most Superliner cars in order to hold non-checked bags. In fact, there are times when Amtrak doesn't use a baggage car at all on this route and relies entirely on these shelves. One thing my mistake highlighted was just how difficult it is to cross multiple tracks at grade with multiple suitcases. At-grade crossings for pedestrians are just as bad at train stations as they are on city streets. They introduce dangerous obstacles and create pinch points where station operations must come to a halt every time a train needs to pass through. Replacing all crosswalks was one of our design goals in the Rio Grande plan, and this issue needs to be taken far more seriously in more places. Since the train arrived with only a 10-minute delay, we were all able to get into bed well before midnight, and fell asleep to the gentle rocking back and forth of our 2-level sleeping car and the occasional sound of the horn blaring far ahead of us. Still, it wasn't enough. With breakfast beginning at 6:30 in the morning, none of us felt as though we really had gotten a good night's rest, and the remainder of that day consisted of long naps to make up for lost sleep. For my part, I slept perfectly fine whenever I wanted to sleep. However, being the foamer I am, I stayed up far too late watching the train race cars across the Bonneville salt flats under the eerie light of an orange quarter moon. Amazingly, our train kept its schedule its entire run and arrived in Emeryville 43 minutes ahead of its published time, something that hadn't happened in nearly a month. This gave us 3.5 hours to wait before our rental cars showed up. And thankfully, Emeryville had both a fantastic playground for the kids and also a public market across the tracks from the station. The market was awesome. Basically, it is a larger version of the Woodbine Food Hall, where we held our first Rio Grande Plan supporters event back in January of this year. There was once a proposal for Salt Lake City to build a similar public market adjacent to the Rio Grande Depot, to which I can only lend my complete support. That location, plus a restored Rio Grande Depot, would be the perfect arrangement of food and travel. Our trip home was another matter. Instead of holding to the published schedule, our train was plagued by nearly every conceivable delay, beginning with a mechanical issue delaying our departure from Emeryville by 20 minutes, a lift bridge holding open for boat traffic that added another hour, unruly passengers needed to be removed from the train on 3 separate occasions, near constant interference from freight trains, and finally an emergency stop when our train hit a trespasser on the tracks at 50 miles an hour. The resulting police investigation meant that our conductors and engineers needed to stay behind while a replacement crew was assembled and transported to our location, a process which kept us stopped for just over 2 hours.
It should go without saying that you should never trespass on railroad tracks, ever, for any reason.
Passenger trains are fast and quiet and cannot stop in less than a quarter mile when traveling at full speed, and freight trains take much, much longer. The number of Americans killed by trains annually is unfortunately rising and is getting close to 1,000 people per year, or nearly 3 per day. Fortunately, the 21-year-old woman who was struck by our train does not belong in that statistic, as she received only a glancing blow and survived with minimal injuries. But even these close calls take their toll on the operating crew. It was our conductor's first such incident, and she seemed pretty shaken up by it. I was very sorry to have to leave her behind. After all these delays, our train arrived in Salt Lake City at 8:01 a.m., just shy of 5 hours behind the published schedule. While this was sad news for everyone who stayed aboard to see the sights in Colorado, this was great news for us, since instead of arriving at 3 a.m., we got to wake up slowly to the unearthly views of the Bonneville Salt Flats. Enjoy one last breakfast in the dining car while passing the south shore of the Great Salt Lake, then gather up our few belongings for an orderly exit. Because we had gotten a full night's rest, we actually were just as bright and refreshed as I had hoped at the beginning. We were able to go home, get dressed, go to church, and continue on with the rest of the day, as if we had woken up in our own beds. Which leads me to an honest but very painful verdict.
Amtrak's California Zephyr is a very good train, and it absolutely is a reasonable travel option between certain city pairs. Unfortunately, with its scheduled departure times at midnight and 3 a.m., I cannot recommend it as a practical travel option for most residents of Salt Lake City.
The accommodations are good, the food is excellent, the travel times are reasonable, the scenery is fascinating, and the connections are solid. But unless you are an adventure seeker, an extreme night owl, a poor broke college student, or some other kind of oddball without a regular sleep schedule, the unusual departure times really do become such a negative that they drag down the entire experience. The biggest disappointment on the outbound trip was how tired we all were after our midnight departure, and the biggest comfort on our return trip was the full night's rest from 10 to 6. The difference was, and forgive the pun, night and day, and we realized that we were incredibly lucky in both directions. Going westbound, the average delay is an hour and a half, meaning most passengers headed west to California from Salt Lake City actually depart at 1 in the morning, meaning even less sleep for them. Headed east, the average delay is 2 hours, meaning the train usually arrives at 5 in the morning rather than 3, and that is just adding insult to injury. So, what is the solution? Unfortunately, Adjusting the California Zephyr's schedule is a non-starter, since Salt Lake City is not the focus of this route. Denver is, with trains departing at 8 a.m. westbound and 7 p.m. eastbound. The section of track just west of Denver is world famous and is what a majority of Zephyr passengers are paying to see. Switching all that to darkness just to appease Salt Lake City travelers is not going to happen. Thus, the only real solution would be to fund an additional Amtrak train on the same route, with a schedule more convenient to us Utahns. A Utah-specific train would also solve half of the unreliable schedule problem, since there would be no stops ahead of Salt Lake City where trains could get delayed. Talk about adding second daily departures to certain long-distance routes is not new, and it looks like this may actually happen pretty soon on the Chicago-Minneapolis corridor. Since the Bay Area is already home to an Amtrak maintenance facility, such a train could arrive in Salt Lake City in the morning, turn around, and depart again in the afternoon with no additional infrastructure, just the use of 2 train consists and crews. I understand that, at the moment, Amtrak has no extra equipment to spare, but as new equipment is ordered, as is rumored to happen before 2030, perhaps the old equipment can remain in service a little longer with the refurbishments I mentioned earlier. And why just the Bay Area? Amtrak also has maintenance facilities in Los Angeles and Seattle, which could be reached in 16 or 23 hours respectively, though I admit 23 hours on a train is stretching things perhaps to the limit. Portland, Oregon would also be included on that route and would be reached in 19 hours, so there is that.
Lastly, I would like to speak about the 2 stations at the ends of our trip, because, of course I do.
Emeryville has an impressive train station for a city its size, with a plain but attractive building, restrooms, indoor and outdoor waiting areas, and baggage handling. But it has these features mainly because the historic end of line of the California Zephyr, Oakland, has a pretty sad situation on its hands. The Western Pacific Passenger Depot is this one, on the corner of Washington and 3rd Streets. Trains would stop in the middle of 3rd Street, so it is understandable that the tracks were removed long ago. At least the building still stands, and is the home of Zephyr Computing Systems, which is an awesome nod to history. The old Southern Pacific Depot in Oakland is this one, called the 16th Street Station. Like the Rio Grande Depot here in Salt Lake City, it was built at the height of the golden age of passenger rail travel in the early 1910s, was damaged in an earthquake, and had its tracks removed in the early 1990s. But unlike the Rio Grande Depot, which still has space for the tracks to return, in Oakland that space was taken in order to construct a new 8-lane freeway. Now, I can accept that San Francisco can't be directly served by Amtrak. It's geographically isolated on its own peninsula, and the 2 tracks that connect it to the mainland are already at capacity, or soon will be when high-speed rail comes online. But, by accepting that, I would expect that the largest city on the East Bay, Oakland, make up for that inconvenience by building an extra convenient rail hub for intercity trains, a real gateway to the Golden City, with connections to BART, buses, and other commuter services. Instead, this responsibility has fallen to the Emeryville station, which has no BART connection and only one Amtrak connector bus. This transfer is actually pretty good, straight across the platform, and the bus goes directly across the bay to the fantastic Transbay Terminal, or at least the curb beside it, since Amtrak won't pay the required access fee to stop inside it. But beyond that, the transit options at Emeryville are surprisingly limited. In Salt Lake City, our temporary station building may be far from downtown and feel more like a mobile construction office than an actual train station, but at least there are good connections to our regional rail and light rail systems, supposing you are willing to wait several hours for service to start up again at 5 a.m. Now, Amtrak does stop at the Richmond BART station further up the bay, but since that stop has no checked luggage service, it isn't helpful to many passengers, including us on our trip, since on the return trip we were able to check our bags. And that is one of the major problems with these sort of organically evolved transit systems. They can be just as incoherent as they are inconvenient. A good master plan for growth would have been extremely useful here, setting unifying goals so that all the local transit agencies could work together towards the same positive user experience.
But here's the thing, it isn't too late for either of these cities.
In Oakland, there is increasing talk of a second Transbay tunnel for both BART and also for Caltrain, after it connects to the Transbay Terminal, and the 16th Street station is right about where both of these projects would surface on the East Bay side. It is still possible to reuse this historic train station as a hub for BART, buses, Caltrain commuter trains up to Sacramento, and Amtrak long-distance services. All that is needed is a consensus, a master plan, and the political will to stick to that plan. In Salt Lake City, we have the opportunity to reuse our own neglected train station. The Rio Grande Depot can once again become the hub of passenger rail along the Wasatch Front and can help usher in a renaissance of intercity rail travel and give the traveling public a real alternative to airplanes and highways. A profound transportation revolution is right on the horizon, where vehicles of all kinds are autonomous, cheap, and easy to access. The pendulum of progress that has favored private vehicle ownership and sprawl for the last 70 years is about to swing back hard in favor of urban areas, transportation as a service, and comfort of the travel experience. Intercity passenger trains can once again prove to be a popular and vital part of our regional and national transportation systems, but only if we are prepared for it.
But how do we prepare, and what will these services look like? Be sure to subscribe because I can't wait to talk about it. I'm Christian Linhart. Thanks for watching.